Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are getting into what is probably one of the most challenging and sensitive topics in religious history.
Absolutely. It's a tough one.
We're looking at the figure of Prophet Muhammad,
Yeah.
who is seen as, the ultimate moral exemplar by millions, and trying to reconcile that with historical reports that he owned, bought, and sold slaves, and also engaged in concubinage.
And our mission here is really specific. It's not about judging or taking sides. It's about a rigorous, neutral analysis of the sources you shared. We're going to audit the intellectual frameworks that Muslim scholars themselves have developed over centuries.
From the classical jurists like Ibn Qayyim and al-Tabari.
All the way up to modern voices. People like Shabir Ally or institutions like the Yaqeen Institute. We're looking at how they explain, defend, or even critique these practices.
Right, so we've taken the 54 most critical questions that you, our listener, sent in, and they really cluster around 4 major themes. First, why was abolition gradual and not immediate? Second, what was the Prophet's personal involvement, the ownership, the trade? Third, the really difficult issue of concubinage, or milk al-yamin.
And consent.
And consent. And finally, how do we judge all this today? Is it anachronism versus a genuine moral flaw? So, to unpack this, we have to start where almost all the scholarship starts.
We do. We have to start with the gradualist framework. It's called Tadri in Arabic. And it's the absolute bedrock of the entire defense.
Okay, so what is it exactly?
Well, classical scholars start by pointing out that slavery was a universal reality in the 7th century. It wasn't an Islamic invention.
It was just there, everywhere.
It was everywhere. The Byzantines, the Romans, the Persians, their entire societies and economies depended on it. So Islam, they argue, inherited this institution. It didn't create it.
But that's the question that a modern listener immediately asks.
Yeah.
If this is a perfect divine revelation, why not just command an instant total ban?
And that gets to the practical argument. According to scholars like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, immediate abolition would have been, frankly, catastrophic.
A total social collapse.
Exactly. A sudden ban would crash the economy, sure. But more importantly, you'd have thousands of newly freed people left completely destitute.
With no support system.
No welfare system, no infrastructure, nothing. They argue the gradual approach was actually the more merciful, the more practical, and the more responsible path to take.
So if you can't just cut it out, the strategy becomes about managing it towards extinction. Restrict the inflow and open up the outflow.
That's a perfect way to put it. You create massive exit doors. So Islam drastically limited the ways you could become a slave. It basically ended debt slavery, kidnapping, leaving only war captives as the main legitimate source.
And what were those exit doors?
They were built right into the religion. Freeing slaves, or manumission, was considered one of the highest acts of piety you could perform.
It was encouraged.
Not just encouraged, it was legally required in some cases. It became a kafara, which is an expiation for certain sins.
Like what?
So if you broke a serious oath, or in cases of accidental killing, freeing a slave was a legally mandated part of your repentance. It's a really powerful mechanism.
It turns repentance into a direct act of liberation for someone else.
Precisely. And it didn't stop there. One of the 8 categories for zakat, that's the mandatory annual charity in Islam, was for freeing slaves. So you literally have this divinely mandated fund dedicated to buying people's freedom every single year.
So while the institution was still there, the regulations were also about humane treatment.
Yes, that was critical. No extreme abuse, no mutilation, and that famous instruction, feed them what you eat, clothe them as you clothe yourselves, and don't overburden them with work. The whole system, in this scholarly view, was designed with an expiration date.
A balance between the ideal and the harsh historical reality. But this brings us to the next very difficult segment. The Prophet's own personal conduct. Sources confirm he owned slaves.
They do, that is confirmed. But the scholarly defense immediately pivots from the fact of ownership to the quality and purpose of it.
What do you mean?
The argument is that by owning slaves, he could model ethical mastership. He could show his followers how to treat them not as property, but as dependents, almost like family.
And they point to specific examples.
Of course. People like Zayd ibn Haritha, who he freed and then adopted as his own son. Or Bilal ibn Rabah, a freed black slave who became one of his most honored and trusted companions, the first muezzin. The argument is he freed far, far more than he ever kept.
I've seen numbers that suggest he owned around 40 individuals over his entire lifetime.
Right, that's a cumulative tally. And apologetic sources really stress that at the time of his death, very few, if any, remained enslaved. This reinforces that lifelong pattern of manumission. Ownership was a tool for liberation and for modeling benevolence.
But we have to address the trade itself, the buying and selling. There's that confirmed incident in Sahih Muslim of him trading one black slave for two others. For anyone today, that detail it sounds awful.
It does, and this is a critical point that needs to be addressed head-on. Classical scholars just saw it as legal economic activity. That was it.
But modern scholars have to explain it differently.
They do. They stress this was a practical act in a pre-existing market, and they deny, absolutely, any racial motive. They argue value was based on skills, health, ability, not race.
And they point to Bilal's status as proof against any systemic racism.
Exactly. They point to the extreme honor shown to Bilal and other black companions to argue that race-based valuation just wasn't part of the Prophet's practice. But then you get this other hadith that seems to contradict the whole push for freedom.
You mean the one where he apparently told a companion not to free a slave but to sell him instead? That seems to put the brakes on everything we've just discussed.
Right, it seems like a total contradiction. But the classical explanation is all about context. It's seen as a lesson in prioritizing competing moral duties.
How so?
The companion was engaging in what you might call impulsive charity. He was about to impoverish himself and, crucially, leave his own children with nothing. The Prophet intervened? No, absolutely not. The jurists set up very strict rules to distinguish it from simple promiscuity. There was a mandatory waiting period, istibra aram, to make sure she wasn't pregnant.
Okay.
There was exclusive access, the master couldn't share her, and an absolute prohibition on forcing them into prostitution, which the Quran explicitly bans. The rules were meant to provide order, maintenance, and a kind of protection.
And the most famous example here is Maria the Copt.
Right. Maria was a gift, a diplomatic gift from the ruler of Egypt. She wasn't a war captive. This was a very common practice between rulers at the time.
And her formal legal status, was she a wife or a concubine?
The majority classical Sunni view is that there was no proven marriage contract. She was a concubine, a Surya, so the relationship was lawful under the framework of Milk al-Yamin.
But her status changed dramatically when she had his son, Ibrahim.
Profoundly. At that moment, she gained the legal status of Walad, mother of a child. This came with huge legal protections. She could no longer be sold, and she was automatically freed the moment the Prophet died.
And scholars cite this as evidence of her being honored.
Yes, as an elevation. A demonstration of how the law was designed to be humane and provide upward mobility within the harsh realities of the time.
Okay, but this brings us to the ethical firewall. The issue that modern people just cannot get past: consent.
You've hit the nerve center of the whole modern debate.
Because regardless of how kind the treatment, can meaningful free consent actually exist in a master-slave relationship? The power imbalance is just. It's absolute.
And this is where you see a major shift. The classical view was simple. Ownership established the right as long as the rules were followed. But modern Muslim ethicists, and this is a critique coming from within the tradition, are very vocal about this.
They acknowledge the problem.
They do. They acknowledge that the inherent structural power imbalance makes free and meaningful consent, by our contemporary standards, structurally impossible. They admit to a moral dissonance here.
They're wrestling with it themselves.
Exactly. They recognize that if Islam is about justice, then the historical practice of Milk al-Yamin creates a tension that has to be resolved today.
And this also applies to the distribution of female captives after battles, like Banu Qurayza. To a modern eye, that looks indistinguishable from sexual slavery.
The historical defense was that this was a form of integration and protection. The alternative in ancient warfare was often execution or abandonment. So it was seen as a pragmatic, even merciful alternative.
But that defense doesn't really hold up today.
Not for a modern ethical framework. The modern understanding of sexual agency makes that practice indefensible, which is what pushes contemporary scholars toward the final solution that they now advocate.
Which brings us to our final segment. How do we judge all this today? The first line of defense scholars often use against criticism is the anachronism debate.
Yes, the charge of presentism. They accuse critics of unfairly judging a 7th century figure by 21st century standards. The argument is you have to judge the Prophet by the radical improvements he made compared to the barbaric pre-Islamic period, not by our standards today.
But the counter-argument is so powerful. If Islam is supposed to be this timeless, universal moral guide, shouldn't its principles of justice and human dignity also be timeless? Why should they be constrained by 7th century norms?
And that is the essential paradox. That's the tension that separates traditionalist thought from reformist thought. This whole problem is magnified when you realize slavery persisted in the Muslim world for another 1,400 years.
So how do they explain that? If the Prophet set this abolitionist trajectory in motion, why didn't his followers finish the job?
They overwhelmingly place the blame on the failure of later Muslims, political elites, caliphs, sultans. They argue that economic interests, the greed of empire, and a general neglect of the Prophet's ethical spirit are what kept the institution alive.
So the fault isn't in the source code, it's in the users.
That's the argument. The fault lies not in the original revelation or the Prophet's model, but in the flawed historical application by later generations who chose power over ethics.
So, setting aside all the history and mystifications, what is the final, clear consensus position from mainstream Muslim scholarship on slavery and concubinage today?
The consensus is absolute. It is unified across almost every major institution and school of thought. Slavery and concubinage are morally condemned, legally closed, and forbidden in practice, period.
And the justification for that hard stop?
It's a shift in emphasis. They argue that the higher principles of the Court on Justice, human dignity, which is explicitly affirmed for all humanity, when combined with binding international law, require Muslims to uphold total abolition today. The institution was tolerated out of necessity in the 7th century, but the timeless ethical spirit of Islam now demands that trajectory be completed.
This has been an incredibly deep and I think very nuanced look at the intellectual scaffolding that's been built to reconcile a difficult history with universal ethical claims.
It's a journey from regulation to abolition, all happening within the theological tradition itself.
So the final thought, the thing we want to leave you, the listener, to think about, really builds on all of this.
It does. The entire defense rests on the idea that immediate abolition was impossible. So the question becomes this: was the Prophet's participation, this path of regulation, gradual reform, was it a necessary moral compromise, something required by the brutal realities of his time? Or was it, in fact, the only viable strategy that could have ever worked to achieve a moral ideal, an ideal that later, more stable, more prosperous generations would finally be ethically required to complete through total abolition? Was it a failure of nerve, or was it the only practical path to mercy?
A profound question to end on. Thank you for guiding us through this very challenging deep dive.
Yeah.
And thank you for joining us on this intellectual journey. We'll see you next time.